my God. Oh my God.
She had just done the hardest thing a woman can do. She had brought life into this world. And in the same breath, in the same room, her husband handed her the end of everything she thought she had. But here's what he didn't know. What nobody in that room knew, not the nurses, not the doctors, and certainly not him, was that 24 hours earlier, his wife had signed her name to a document worth $1 billion. He thought he was leaving her with nothing. He had no idea he was the one about to lose everything. There are moments in life that split everything into two halves, the before and the after. Moments so sharp, so precise in their cruelty, that the people who live through them spend years trying to make sense of how two completely opposite things could happen at the exact same time. How a woman could be holding the greatest gift of her life in her arms and be handed the worst betrayal of her life in the same breath. How one room, a hospital room, of all places, could contain both the beginning of everything and what one man thought was the end. This is one of those stories. And if you think you know where it's going, I promise you, you don't. Because this is not a story about a divorce. It is not even really a story about money. It is a story about what happens when a man spends years looking at a woman and seeing only what he wants to see, and what happens when reality finally corrects him. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Drop your location in the comments right now. Tell us where in the world you are watching from, because this community spans every corner of the globe, and we want to know where you are joining us from today. We read every single comment. And if this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the stories we bring you are the kind that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Now, we need to lay something out before this story begins in earnest, because there are 3 questions that are going to follow us through every single minute of what you are about to hear, and you need to hold all 3 of them in your mind at the same time. The first question is this: how does a woman who is about to give birth find herself holding a billion-dollar secret that her own husband knows absolutely nothing about? The second question is this: why did a man who had been married to that woman for nearly a decade choose the most sacred and vulnerable moment of her life, the moment she was holding their newborn child, to hand her the legal document that ended their marriage? And the third question, the one that will not let you go, is this: when the truth finally came out, who paid the price? Because in this story, the answer to that last question is not the one that Daniel had planned for. Not even close. Keep those 3 questions with you. We are going to answer all of them. But to answer them properly, we have to go back. All the way back. Not to the hospital room, not to the billion-dollar deal, not even to the marriage. We have to go back to a small house in Columbus, Ohio, in the mid-1980s, where a little girl named Claire grew up watching her mother do the impossible every single day without anyone ever calling it impossible. Because what Claire learned in that house, in those early years, watching her mother hold everything together with both hands and receive almost no credit for it, what she learned there is the foundation of everything that came after. Everything that Daniel missed. Everything that the story of that hospital room is actually about. Claire's mother, Margaret, was a woman who understood something that the world rarely rewards and almost never acknowledges: the power of doing necessary things without complaint and without recognition. She worked the early shift at a dry cleaning facility in their neighborhood, which meant she was up before the sun every weekday morning and home in the early afternoon. And in the hours between arriving home and the children getting back from school, she dealt with the landlord and the grocery store and the utility bills and all the invisible infrastructure of a life that looked small from the outside and was enormous from the inside. She helped 3 daughters with homework at the kitchen table every evening. She balanced a checkbook that never quite balanced and somehow made it work anyway. She clipped coupons on Saturday mornings and organized them by category into a little accordion folder she kept in the kitchen drawer next to the takeout menus. She negotiated with the landlord when the rent went up and they didn't have the extra $60. And she usually won, not because she was aggressive, but because she was prepared. And there is almost nothing more powerful in a negotiation than being the person in the room who has done the work. Claire watched all of it. She was the kind of child who watches more than she speaks, who absorbs more than she reveals, and who files everything she sees in some interior drawer and retrieves it years later when it becomes useful. She watched her mother smile through dinners where there wasn't quite enough food, making sure every child had a full plate before she touched her own. She watched her mother put on her good coat for parent-teacher conferences and walk into those schools with her head up and her voice steady. And she watched the teachers who had underestimated what Margaret's household looked like from the outside recalibrate quickly when they understood who they were actually talking to. And something inside of Claire, something quiet, something steady, something that was forming in the way that the most important parts of a person form, slowly and without fanfare, decided very early on that she was going to build a life where she never had to choose between her dignity and her survival. That was not an angry decision. It was not a bitter one. It was a promise she made to herself in the way that children make the most serious promises, quietly, privately, and with an absolute certainty that she would keep it no matter what. Claire was the middle child of 3 daughters. Her older sister, Patricia, was the social one, the one who knew everyone in the neighborhood by name and remembered their birthdays and could walk into any room and immediately understand its social geometry and position herself exactly right within it. Her younger sister, Denise, was the creative one, always drawing in the margins of her notebooks, always making up stories, always seeing the world in colors and shapes that nobody else quite registered. And Claire was the one in the middle, the quiet one, the one who sat in the back of the classroom and absorbed everything, the one who teachers underestimated until about 3 weeks into the school year, when the first tests came back, and then never underestimated again. She was the kind of student who did not raise her hand unless she was absolutely certain. Not because she was unsure of herself, but because she understood, even as a child, that there is power in being the person in the room who knows more than they show. That patience has a kind of strategic value that impatience will never understand. She learned that at her mother's kitchen table. She carried it everywhere she went for the rest of her life. She carried it through high school, where she ran the student newspaper and kept the finances of every club she participated in so organized that the faculty advisor eventually asked her to help restructure the school's entire extracurricular budget. She carried it through college at Ohio State, where she studied finance and business and graduated in the top 8% of her class, while working 20 hours a week at a campus bookstore to cover the costs that her scholarship didn't. She carried it through her first real job at a mid-sized investment consulting firm in Cincinnati, where she was one of 2 women on a team of 14 analysts, and where the culture of the floor was the kind that tests people quietly, where the men held certain conversations in certain rooms that women were not invited into, where accomplishments were acknowledged differently depending on who had achieved them, and where navigating all of that while doing excellent work required a particular kind of endurance that Claire had been training for her entire life without knowing that was what she was doing. By the time Claire was 28 years old, she had built a reputation in a very specific corner of the corporate world, a quiet, precise, highly specialized corner that most people have never heard of, but that moves enormous amounts of money every single day. She worked in corporate acquisitions. She helped companies buy other companies. She studied the numbers, identified the targets, structured the deals, negotiated the terms. And she was, by every measure that mattered in that world, exceptionally good at it. Her colleagues described her the same way, over and over, throughout the years. Measured, patient, thorough, never reactive, never loud, and absolutely relentless. The kind of person who you could put in the most complicated room in the building and trust completely not to flinch, not to overplay, and not to leave anything on the table. That was Claire at 28. That was Claire at 30. And that was Claire when she met a man named Daniel at a company event in the spring of what would turn out to be a year that changed everything in ways that neither of them could see coming. Daniel was 34 when they met. He was tall, well-dressed, confident in the way that men who grow up with money often are, not aggressively, not arrogantly, but with a quiet assumption that the world would accommodate him, and that this was simply the natural order of things. He came from a family with established wealth. His father had run a regional manufacturing company for 30 years. His mother sat on the board of 2 charitable foundations and lunched every Thursday with the same 3 women she had known since their daughters were in kindergarten together. Daniel had attended a good university, studied business, done reasonably well, and moved to Chicago in his late 20s to pursue a career in commercial real estate development, which in his mid-30s was going reasonably well. He had closed several significant deals in the Chicago area. He was respected in his professional circles. He was, by the measure of the world he had grown up in, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. What Claire noticed about Daniel in those first few months was not his confidence or his family background or his professional standing. What she noticed was that he was curious. He asked questions and then actually listened to the answers. He remembered details, small ones, the kind of details that most people forget the moment the conversation moves on. He remembered that she took her coffee with 1 sugar and a splash of oat milk. He remembered that her mother's name was Margaret and that she worked hard, and that Claire talked about her with a kind of reverence that was not performance, but the real thing. He remembered, 3 weeks after she had mentioned it once in passing, that she had been nervous about a major presentation at work, and he called her that afternoon to ask how it went. These were not grand gestures. They were small ones. But for a woman who had spent most of her adult life being the person who paid careful attention to everyone else, being seen that carefully by someone else felt like something she had not known she was missing until it arrived. They dated for a little over a year. They got engaged on a Tuesday evening in November, in the kitchen of Claire's apartment, with no ring yet because Daniel had wanted to take her to choose it herself, and she had loved that about him. The understanding that she was not someone to whom things should be presented already decided. They got married the following October, in a mid-sized ceremony at a vineyard in southern Ohio, with both their families present and about 60 friends who stood in the golden light of a late autumn afternoon and watched 2 people promise each other everything. Denise gave a toast that made half the room cry. Margaret wore a blue dress she had bought 3 months in advance and pressed twice before the day. Claire wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. And Daniel looked at her across that vineyard and smiled the way that people smile when they believe completely in the moment they are standing in. Whatever came after, and so much came after, that moment was real. Both of them were there, fully, in good faith. That is important to remember, because this story is not about 2 people who were always wrong for each other. It is about what happened when one of them started growing in a direction the other one was not willing to follow. For the first 3 years, the marriage was genuinely good. They lived in Chicago, where Daniel's work was based and where Claire had taken a senior analyst position at a larger acquisitions firm. They built a life together. They shared a kitchen and a calendar and a set of habits. Sunday morning coffee and the newspaper spread across the dining table. Friday evenings trying new restaurants and rating them on a scale they made up themselves. Long phone calls with their families on alternating holidays. They argued sometimes, the way married people argue, about money, about time, about whose turn it was to deal with the plumber. But they came back to each other. And for a while, that felt like enough. Maybe it was enough, for a while. The shift was subtle. That is almost always true of the shifts that matter most. They do not arrive as events. They arrive as weather. And by the time you notice the temperature has changed, you have been standing in it for months. The shift began, most people who knew them agree, sometime around the end of Claire's second year at the acquisitions firm. That was the year she was promoted to senior analyst with her own team. That was the year her name began appearing in internal memos not as a contributor, but as the person who led the work. That was the year a deal she had spent 14 months structuring. A complex mid-market acquisition that had gone through 3 rounds of renegotiation and had nearly collapsed twice. Closed for $430 million. And that was the year the firm's managing director stood up at a company-wide meeting and said, in front of everyone, that Claire's work on that transaction had been some of the most methodical and effective deal architecture he had seen in 20 years in the industry. Daniel attended the celebration dinner for that deal. He sat at the table and raised his glass with the rest of the room when the toast was made. And then, on the drive home, he was quiet in a way that Claire had begun to recognize. A quiet that was not restful, not tired, but compressed. The kind of quiet that has something inside of it pressing against the walls. She asked him if he was okay. He said he was tired. She let it go. She was getting good at letting things go, not because she didn't notice them, but because she had not yet decided what to do with what she was noticing. Daniel's commercial real estate work had begun to plateau. The Chicago market had tightened. Several projects he had felt confident about ran into financing complications that extended timelines and compressed margins. He brought on a business partner who turned out to have different priorities and different ethics, and the dissolution of that partnership cost him both money and significant time. By his late 30s, Daniel was not growing. He was managing. And there is a particular and difficult thing that happens in some people. Not all people, but some. when they find themselves managing while the person sleeping next to them is expanding, and they cannot separate the difficulty of their own situation from the presence of the person who is thriving. It becomes a kind of noise, and the noise makes it harder to hear anything else. He started to pull back in small ways that accumulated into something larger. He stopped asking about her work. He stopped attending the professional events that she occasionally invited him to, citing scheduling conflicts that, over time, became a kind of standing policy. He began spending more time with a group of friends from his college years, men who, like him, had grown up with certain ideas about how their lives would look at 40, and who were, like him, quietly renegotiating what those ideas meant now that reality had delivered something different than the brochure. Claire noticed all of it. She chose, for a long time, to be patient. Because patience was what she knew, and because she still believed, in the part of her that had watched her mother hold everything together through the difficult seasons, that marriages were survivable things if you were willing to stay in them. She tried, in the way she knew how. She cut back at work, not dramatically, but enough to be home more, to make dinners more regularly, to be available in the evenings when she had previously been finishing work. She suggested they see a marriage counselor, and to his credit, Daniel agreed. They went 3 times. The sessions were careful and structured and revealed, in the way that structured conversations between people who are not fully honest with themselves often do. Only the surface of what was actually happening. After the 3rd session, Daniel said he did not think it was helping and that he did not want to go back. Claire sat with that for a week and then made her peace with it, because she had learned, by that point, that you cannot force someone into a room they have already decided to leave. She planned a trip to Charleston, South Carolina, a place he had mentioned more than once wanting to visit. She organized it carefully, the way she organized everything, finding a hotel in the historic district and making reservations at restaurants she had researched, and planning 2 days of walking the city without any agenda at all. They went in the fall, when the weather in Charleston is soft and the light on the water in the late afternoon is the kind of light that makes people feel like the world is larger and kinder than it usually seems. And those 4 days were genuinely good. They walked and ate and laughed at something they saw in a gallery window, and sat on a hotel balcony in the evening and talked the way they used to talk before the quiet had moved in. And then they came home to Chicago, and the quiet came back with them, and Claire understood something that she did not yet have the words for, that the trip had not fixed anything. That what was broken was not something a trip could fix. That what was broken was something in Daniel's relationship with himself, and that until he addressed that, no amount of good dinners or careful planning from her was going to bridge the distance. And so Claire did what she had always done when the external world was beyond her control. She turned inward, not in a way that meant giving up, in a way that meant going to work. By the time she discovered she was pregnant, in the early spring of a year that would become the most consequential of her life, there were 2 parallel stories running inside Claire's world. There was the marriage, which was fragile and quiet and survivable, but not thriving, and which she had not yet decided what to do about. And there was the other thing, the thing she had been building in the margins, in the early mornings and the late evenings, in the space between the life she was living with Daniel and the life she was building for herself. We are going to get to that in detail, because it is the center of everything. But first, you need to know what happened when she found out she was pregnant, because the way she experienced that moment tells you everything about where she was emotionally at that point in her life. She took the test on a Wednesday morning before Daniel was awake. She sat on the edge of the bathroom tub and held the result in her hands for a long time. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10, long enough that the morning light coming through the frosted glass of the window moved an inch across the tile floor. And then she felt something she had not expected and that she almost did not recognize at first, because she was so practiced at managing her feelings carefully before she let herself have them. She felt hope, not the ordinary, manageable kind of hope, the deep kind, the kind that arrives from somewhere below your reasoning, somewhere that does not ask your permission before it shows up. She hoped that this child would be the thing that brought them back to each other. She hoped that the arrival of a new life would soften something in Daniel that had been hardening, open something that had been closing, restore something of the man she had married who had remembered small details and asked real questions and looked at her like she was worth seeing. She wanted that to be true. And wanting it to be true made her believe it more than the evidence supported. That is one of the most human things about Claire's story. That even a woman who was exceptionally clear-eyed in every other area of her life was capable, in this one, of hoping against what she actually knew. She told Daniel that evening. He was at the kitchen table with his laptop. She placed the test on the table in front of him and waited. He looked at it. He looked at her. And he said, she would remember the exact phrasing for the rest of her life. Okay, we'll figure it out. Not joy, not fear, not tears. We'll figure it out. Like it was a project. Like it was a scheduling challenge that required management. She kept her face very still. She said, yes, we will. And she went to bed. She called her sister Denise from under the covers that night, with her phone screen turned to its lowest brightness. Denise reacted the way Denise always reacted to things that mattered. Immediately, completely, without any of the restraint that Claire had spent a lifetime cultivating. She cried. She said, "Oh my God," 3 times. She said things about what a wonderful mother Claire was going to be, and she said them with such complete certainty that Claire, lying in the dark while her husband slept in the next room, started crying too. And she could not have told you, if you had asked, whether she was crying from joy or from something else. Probably both. Almost certainly both. Now, we need to talk about the other thing. The thing that was running alongside the pregnancy, alongside the marriage, alongside all of it. The thing that Daniel not only didn't know about, but would have found almost impossible to believe if someone had told him. Because while their life together was continuing in the way that lives continue when they are stuck, quietly, under pressure, held together by routine and inertia and the mutual avoidance of the hard conversation, Claire had been building something. Methodically, patiently, in the way she had been building things since she was a child, watching her mother organize coupons into an accordion folder. Piece by piece, decision by decision, document by document. Invisible to everyone who was not paying close enough attention. It had started as a lunch meeting, 18 months before the pregnancy. 3 people at a restaurant in the West Loop neighborhood of Chicago, a man named James, who had been in the acquisitions industry for 15 years and had recently left his firm to go independent, and a woman named Sandra, who ran a boutique financial advisory practice out of Atlanta. Claire had worked with both of them, separately, on different deals over the years. She trusted them in the precise, professional way that you trust people you have been in a difficult negotiation with. Not with everything, but with the things that matter most when the room is on fire and someone has to hold the line. James had an idea, and it was a good one. He had spent years watching a particular segment of the acquisition market. Companies with annual revenue between $50 and $200 million be chronically underserved by the major firms, which focused their resources and attention on the larger, more glamorous deals. These mid-market companies had strong fundamentals. They had capable leadership. They had real value. But they didn't have access to the kind of sophisticated deal structuring that the big players got as a matter of course, which meant they were consistently leaving money on the table, or selling at the wrong time, or getting acquired by the wrong partners under terms that didn't serve their long-term interests. James wanted to build a firm that worked exclusively in this space. He needed partners. He needed capital. And he needed someone who could do what Claire did. Look at the numbers and understand not just what they showed on the surface, but what they meant underneath. What the story was that the numbers were telling, and what that story predicted about what would happen next. Claire listened to the entire pitch. She asked 17 questions, specific ones, the kind that reveal whether the person asking has already been thinking hard about the subject or is just discovering it for the first time. James answered all of them. At the end of lunch, she said she needed to think about it. She thought about it for 6 weeks. She ran the numbers. She stress-tested the model under 3 different market conditions, including a significant downturn scenario. She had a separate conversation with Sandra, without James in the room, and asked her the questions that needed to be asked privately, about James's judgment under pressure, about his reputation with difficult counterparties, about whether the gap between his vision and his execution had ever been a problem. Sandra was honest. She said James was excellent under most conditions and needed managing under a few specific ones, and she described exactly which ones. That was the kind of information Claire needed. 7 weeks after the lunch, she called James and told him she was in. She retained her own attorney, not the firm's attorneys, her own, privately, a woman she had identified through professional channels and then vetted carefully before engaging. She established a separate corporate entity for her equity stake. She capitalized it with funds that were entirely and documentably hers, traced to specific accounts that predated the marriage, to professional bonuses that had been paid into accounts in her name alone, to a modest inheritance from her maternal grandmother that she had never mentioned to Daniel because she had always thought of it as hers in a way that went beyond the legal definition. Every document was dated. Every transaction was traceable. Every decision was made with a specific awareness that in a world where marriages sometimes end, the most important thing a woman can do is know exactly what belongs to her and be able to prove it. She did not tell Daniel. She had stopped telling Daniel things that mattered a while before this, not out of hostility, but because she had learned, in the quiet, thorough way she learned everything, that the things she was most proud of were safest when she held them privately. When she had shared professional accomplishments with him in the earlier years, his responses had been fine. Technically fine. He had said the right things. But there was something in the fine responses that felt like a glass placed too carefully on the counter, correct, but deliberately, in a way that revealed effort rather than ease. And she had stopped wanting to feel the effort. So she stopped sharing. And in the absence of sharing, she had simply built, in the quiet of her own early mornings and late evenings, something that had no need of his awareness in order to exist. By the time she was 5 months pregnant, the firm that she and James and Sandra had built together was no longer a concept. It had a name, an office, a client list, and a track record. It had completed 4 acquisitions in its first year of operation, all of them in the 50 to 200 million range, all of them structured with the kind of precision that comes from 3 people who have, between them, seen every way a deal can go wrong and built systems to prevent each of those things from happening. Word had spread in the specific way that word spreads in specialized professional communities, quietly, carefully, from one trusted contact to another, and by the middle of Claire's pregnancy, the firm had been noticed by people who paid attention to these things. One of the people who noticed was the senior partner of a global investment group with offices in New York, London, and Singapore. Her name was Margaret. And yes, the fact that she shared a name with Claire's mother is one of those coincidences that real life occasionally offers, the ones that feel too deliberate to be random and too real to be invented. Margaret had been in institutional finance for 30 years. She was the kind of person who did not need to be in every room, because the rooms that mattered came to her. She had been watching the mid-market acquisition space for 2 years and had determined that the right platform had not yet been built in that segment. And then it was Claire's firm. The approach came in Claire's 7th month. A formal acquisition offer, with a term sheet and a timeline and legal teams on both sides and weeks of due diligence that ran through Claire's 8th month of pregnancy. The calls happened at 7 in the morning and 11 at night, and every available hour in between. Claire ran them from her home office while Daniel slept in the next room. The door closed, her voice low, a legal pad open on the desk, and a maternity pillow propped behind her, and her handwriting getting smaller and more precise as the negotiations got more complex, which was the opposite of what happened to most people under pressure and was one of the things that made her remarkable. She was 37 weeks pregnant when the final terms were agreed upon. She was 37 weeks and 4 days pregnant when her attorney walked her through the complete agreement one final time and asked if she had any remaining questions. She said she did not. She was 37 weeks and 5 days pregnant. In the kitchen, at the table, 11:47 in the evening, when she picked up a pen and signed her name to a document that valued her personal stake in the acquired firm at just over $1 billion. She sat with that for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the city was doing what the city always did at that hour, still alive, but quieter than it would be in 6 hours when the commuters arrived. She did not open champagne, because she was 37 weeks pregnant, and because there was no one to drink it with who would have understood what they were celebrating. She placed the signed documents carefully into the folder her attorney had prepared, slid it into the drawer of her home office desk, and locked the drawer. Then she rested both hands on her stomach, where her daughter was moving in the slow, deliberate way of a baby who is almost ready, and she said, quietly, to no one but that child, "We are going to be okay." Then she went to bed. She woke up 11 hours later with contractions. At 6:14 in the morning, her water broke. She called for Daniel. He was already awake, already dressed. He drove her to the hospital. She would tell Denise later that the drive was mostly quiet, that he asked once if she was in pain, She said it was manageable, and they did not speak much after that. They pulled into the hospital parking structure, and he helped her out of the car, and they walked through the entrance together, and he held the door, and for those few ordinary minutes of logistics, it almost felt, she said, like it used to feel. Like a unit. Like a team. What Claire did not know as she walked through those hospital doors, what she had no way of knowing, was that Daniel had visited his attorney's office the week before. The meeting had been brief and businesslike. The paperwork had been drafted and reviewed and signed on Daniel's end and notarized and placed into a standard legal envelope. The envelope had been in the glove compartment of his car since that visit. It had been there during the drive to the hospital. It had been there while he held the door. He had a plan. He had a timeline. And he had chosen this moment, not carelessly, but deliberately. Whether the calculation was that serving her at her most vulnerable would reduce resistance, or whether he simply believed there was no good moment, and this one was as practical as any other, is something only Daniel knows. What is clear, from every account, is that he arrived at that hospital with both a child about to be born and an ending already prepared. And that is something that is very difficult to understand about a person, even when you know all the facts surrounding it. 11 hours of labor. Denise arrived around the 4th hour, having driven from Indianapolis the moment she got the call. She walked into that room and understood immediately that something was off in the atmosphere. Not in Claire, who was managing the labor with the same focused endurance she brought to everything, but in the room itself, in the specific quality of Daniel's presence near the window, which was the presence of someone waiting rather than someone being there. She knew her sister. She had known her for their entire lives. And she knew what someone who was present looked like, and this was not it. She stayed close to Claire. She held her hand through the hard contractions. She talked to her quietly about unimportant things, their mother's garden, a television show they both watched, because that is what you do for someone who needs their mind somewhere else for a few minutes at a time. At 5:43 in the afternoon, Claire's daughter was born. 7 pounds and 2 ounces. Perfect. The cry that a newborn makes in the first seconds is one of the most irreducible sounds in human experience. It is pure need and pure presence and pure aliveness, all at once, and it fills a room completely. The nurses wrapped her and placed her in Claire's arms, and Claire looked at her daughter for the first time, and something changed in her face in the way that faces change when a person sees something they have never seen before and yet recognize completely. The way you recognize something that was always yours and has simply been returned to you. Denise was crying before she could stop herself. She said later that it was one of the most beautiful moments she had ever been allowed to witness. That the room felt different. That even the light felt different. That her sister looked more peaceful in that moment than she had in years. That peace lasted 11 minutes. Denise said she almost did not register it at first, because she was so completely focused on the baby, on Claire, on the ordinary miracle of those first minutes. She heard footsteps crossing the room. She saw Daniel approach the bed, and in the first fraction of a second she actually, genuinely thought, that he was coming to see his daughter. He came to the side of the bed. He reached past Claire, carefully, without touching her, and placed a sealed legal envelope on the tray beside her. He looked at his wife, who was still looking at their child, who had not yet raised her eyes. He said 2 words, "Sign these." And then he left the room. Denise said the silence that followed was total. She stood completely still. She watched her sister continue to hold her daughter and look at her for another few seconds. Seconds that, Denise said, seemed to last much longer than seconds. And then she watched Claire's eyes travel, slowly, as if she already knew she did not want to the envelope on the tray. She watched Claire shift her daughter carefully into one arm. She watched her reach for the envelope and open it. She watched her read the first page. And then she watched Claire look up. Not at Denise. Not at Daniel, who was gone. Not at anything in the room. Just up. As if the ceiling had something to tell her. As if she were consulting something inside herself that lived higher up than the rest of her. And then Claire said, in the quietest and steadiest voice Denise had ever heard her use for words, "He has no idea." That was all. She did not say it with anger. She did not say it with satisfaction. She said it in the way a person states a fact that is both correct and sad. Sad in the way that the limits of another person's understanding are always sad, when they have cost you something you deserved not to lose. Now we need to pause here, because this is the moment that everything turns on, And it is important that you understand what those 4 words actually meant. Because what Claire knew, in that hospital room, holding her daughter, with a divorce petition on the tray beside her, was something that Daniel had no idea about. He did not know about the firm. He did not know about the acquisition. He did not know about the 1147 signature the night before. He did not know about the $1 billion. He had walked into that hospital with a plan, with legal documents, with a timeline, and he had executed his plan with precision and with what he believed was a complete understanding of the situation. And he was wrong. He was wrong in the most complete way a person can be wrong. Not about a detail, not about a calculation, but about the most fundamental thing. He was wrong about who he was dealing with. Now, you might expect that what happened next was chaos. Tears. Confrontation. Claire calling him back into the room and demanding an explanation. Some version of the dramatic reckoning that we have been trained by 1,000 stories to expect in moments like this one. But that is not what happened. Because Claire was not that kind of person. What happened next was the thing that Claire always did when the external world delivered something that required a response. She got quiet. She got clear. And she got to work. She was discharged from the hospital with her daughter 2 days later. Before she left, she had made 3 phone calls. The first was to her personal attorney. The second was to the lead counsel on the acquisition agreement. The third was to a forensic financial investigator who had been recommended to her months earlier at a professional conference by a colleague who described him as the person you call when someone is trying to take something that belongs to you. Claire had saved the number in her phone under a first name only. She had not known, when she saved it, that she would need it. But she had saved it. Because that was who she was. She planned for things she hoped would never happen. Because she understood that hoping something never happens is not the same as being prepared if it does. Her attorney came to her apartment the day after she was discharged. Her daughter was asleep against her chest in the carrier. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Claire had signed the acquisition documents 6 days earlier, and went through everything. Every document, every timeline, every decision, every date. Her attorney, a woman named Patricia who had practiced family and corporate law for 23 years, listened to all of it without interrupting. When Claire finished, Patricia sat back and looked at the table for a moment, and then she said something that Claire has shared in the years since whenever people have asked her about that period. Patricia said, "He filed first. But you were ready first." Then she opened her laptop, and they got to work. Here is what Daniel had not accounted for. His assumption, the one that ran underneath his plan the way an assumption runs underneath every plan, invisible because it feels too obvious to examine, was that Claire's professional life was something that existed within the frame of their marriage. That whatever she had built as his wife, using time and energy that were technically marital resources, and that therefore any significant outcome of that building belonged, at least in part, to the marriage. It was not an unreasonable assumption in the abstract. There are cases and jurisdictions where something like that argument has genuine legal merit. But it ran into a very specific problem in Claire's case, and the problem was the documentation. The corporate entity through which Claire held her stake in the acquired firm had been established 14 months before Daniel filed for divorce. The capital used to fund it was documented to specific premarital sources. The legal provisions governing her ownership stake, the ones she had insisted upon during the acquisition negotiation, the ones that isolated each partner's individual interest clearly and completely, had been drafted and signed and dated months before any divorce petition existed. Every decision Claire had made, over 18 months, had been made in exactly the right order. Not to trap Daniel. Not because she had anticipated this specific sequence of events, but because she was someone who understood that the work you do carefully, in the quiet, before anyone is watching, is the work that holds when everything else is under pressure. Daniel discovered the deal 6 days after he left the hospital. The exact mechanism is not entirely clear from the accounts that survive. Some say a mutual colleague mentioned it at a dinner. Others point to a brief item in a financial trade publication that covered the acquisition in its standard deal announcement section. What is clear is that the moment of discovery was not quiet. People who were around Daniel in the days that followed described him as someone who had experienced a significant shock, not a visible, dramatic breakdown, but the kind of internal disruption that shows in small ways, in the speed of responses and the quality of focus and the particular way a person looks at their phone after they have read something that has fundamentally changed their understanding of their situation. He called his attorney the same day. The call was followed by an emergency meeting. The meeting was followed by a flurry of legal activity that anyone who works in family law would recognize immediately as the response of a side that had just discovered its strategy was built on incomplete information. His team filed motions arguing that the acquisition proceeds should be classified as marital assets, that the firm had been built during the marriage, using time and energy that existed within the marriage, and that Daniel was therefore entitled to an equitable share. It was a serious argument, pressed by serious attorneys, and it might have had more traction in a different case. But it did not have traction in this one, because of the documentation, because of the timeline, and because of something that happened several weeks into the proceedings that nobody had anticipated. Margaret, the senior partner at the Global Investment Group, the woman who shared a name with Claire's mother, the woman who had been one of only 2 people outside the firm who knew about the deal before it closed, decided to get involved. She had been watching the story from a distance. She had read the coverage in the financial and general press. She was a woman who had spent 30 years in a world that had not always treated women like her fairly, and who had built her career partly on a policy of never intervening in things that were not her business and always intervening in things that were. This, she had decided, was her business. She gave a sworn statement. It was precise and thorough and completely without drama, in the way that the most devastating things often are. She confirmed that the acquisition structure, specifically the provisions isolating each partner's ownership stake, had been designed to protect the confidentiality of the negotiation during a sensitive phase of the deal, which was standard practice for transactions of this type, and had nothing to do with hiding assets from anyone. She confirmed that the documentation establishing Claire's corporate entity had been reviewed and accepted by the investment group's own legal team months before the divorce was filed. She confirmed the dates. She confirmed the timeline. And she confirmed, under oath, that every decision Claire had made had been reviewed, validated, and found to be in complete legal compliance by attorneys working on behalf of one of the most sophisticated institutional investors in the industry. In other words, Claire had not engineered a trap. She had built a career. The trap, to the extent that there was one, had been entirely of Daniel's own making. Now the story became public. Not immediately, and not all at once, but in the way that things in a world with social media and financial press and professional networks become public, through overlapping channels, each one catching a different edge of the story and carrying it to a different audience. A legal filing became public record. A financial journalist noticed the names on the acquisition announcement and cross-referenced them with the divorce filing. A family member, whose identity has been protected and whose motives were probably not entirely uncomplicated, spoke to someone who was not careful with the information. And then it was in enough places that it could not be contained. The reaction was immediate and divided, in the way that stories about women and money and marriage always divide people. There were people who said that Claire had been calculating, that keeping the deal secret was a deliberate strategy, that a woman who truly had nothing to hide would have told her husband about $1 billion acquisition before it closed. There were people who said that this reading missed the point entirely, that a woman in a deteriorating marriage is under no obligation to disclose her professional achievements to the person who is already diminishing them, and that the suggestion that she should have reflects assumptions about what wives owe their husbands that would never be applied in the other direction. There were people who focused entirely on Daniel's conduct in that hospital room and said that whatever you thought about the legal questions, a man who places a divorce petition on a hospital tray while his wife is holding their newborn child 11 minutes after birth has told you something important about who he is. And there were people who said that this was a complicated story about a complicated marriage, and that the truth was probably somewhere that none of the commentary had found yet. What the public reaction did, beyond creating heat and noise, was bring in more people. Lawyers who had opinions about the legal questions. Financial journalists who ran analyses of the acquisition terms. Women who had gone through divorces with similar power dynamics, and who recognized in Claire's situation something they had lived themselves. And a small number of people. People who had been in that hospital. People who had been in those boardrooms. People who had been in the negotiations, who had first-hand information and who were quietly sharing it with attorneys and journalists, and, eventually, with the court. The proceedings were long. They were financially and emotionally expensive in the way that contested divorce proceedings always are. There were depositions that lasted hours and produced transcripts that ran to hundreds of pages. There were motions and counter-motions and scheduling delays and moments where both sides sat across a conference table and tried to negotiate a resolution and failed and went back to their respective offices and tried again. There were moments in those proceedings that observers described as genuinely painful. Not the legal arguments, which were professional and measured, but the human residue underneath them, the evidence of a real relationship that had once been something and was now being processed through a system designed to assign value to things that resist valuation. The judge was thorough. She asked good questions. She read everything. She called for additional documentation on 3 separate occasions, each time examining a specific aspect of the timeline or the corporate structure with a precision that made it clear she was not going to rule on incomplete information. And she gave both sides the time they needed to put everything before her, because she understood that this was not a simple case and that getting it wrong would matter. She ruled on a Thursday morning in a written decision that ran to 43 pages. The core finding was clear. The acquisition proceeds were non-marital assets, protected under the terms of the corporate structure and the documented timeline of its establishment. The entity through which Claire held her stake had been created before the divorce was filed. The capital that funded it was traceable to premarital sources. The acquisition itself had been completed the day before Daniel served the papers, meaning that even if you believe the most aggressive version of Daniel's argument, the deal was done before the marriage legally ended, which made the timing another layer of irony in a story that already had several. Daniel was entitled to equitable division of the assets that had been genuinely shared during the marriage, the apartment they had lived in, the joint savings and investment accounts, certain shared assets that had been accumulated together over the years they were married. That was not nothing. By any ordinary measure, it was a substantial amount, but it was not $1 billion. And it was very far from what Daniel had calculated when he had sat in a law office 3 months before his daughter was born and laid out his strategy with an attorney who had reviewed all the available information and had not known, because Daniel had not known, that there was a great deal of information that was not available. The 43-page ruling included a passage that legal observers noted afterward as unusual in its directness, not in its language, which was careful and measured as judicial language tends to be, but in what it chose to say explicitly about the nature of the assets in question. The judge wrote that the acquisition proceeds could not be considered marital in character because they had been built, documented, and completed through instruments that predated the marriage's legal dissolution and were independent of the marital estate by every applicable measure. She wrote that the timeline of the corporate entity's establishment and capitalization was clear and undisputed. And she wrote, and this is the sentence that people who followed the case have cited most often since, that the record did not support a finding that any asset belonging to the petitioner had been concealed from the marriage, because the record showed that the asset in question had been built in a space that the marriage had not occupied. That the marriage had not occupied that space was not a question before the court. It was simply a fact and evidence. Daniel received his equitable share of their shared life. His attorneys negotiated carefully and professionally, and, by all accounts, as well as the facts allowed. He was not left with nothing, but he was left with something very far from what he had expected. And everyone who understood the full arc of the story understood, without it needing to be said, that he had miscalculated in the most fundamental way possible. He had made an assumption about what existed inside his own marriage and had turned out to be wrong, not by a margin, but completely. In the months after the ruling, while the story was still being discussed in the circles that had followed it, something else was happening that eventually overtook all of the legal and financial conversation. Claire had begun making decisions about what came next. Not reactive decisions, not decisions made in the heat of what had just happened, but the kind of deliberate, patient, forward-looking decisions that had always been her mode of operating. She was thinking about her daughter. She was thinking about the kind of life she wanted to build now, in this new configuration, with these new resources, and with the particular freedom that comes from having survived something hard and come through it intact. And she was thinking about something that had been forming in her mind for a long time, something that the experience of the past 2 years and everything she had witnessed in her own professional life about who gets access to capital and who does not had clarified into something she knew she was going to do. She announced the formation of the Delivery Fund approximately 18 months after the ruling. She seeded it with a meaningful portion of her personal holdings, a commitment that the financial press covered with the combination of admiration and curiosity that tends to accompany any large voluntary allocation of private capital to a philanthropic purpose. The fund's stated mission was to provide capital, strategic mentorship, and access to the deal structuring expertise that Claire had spent her career developing, to companies led by women that had been systematically underfunded, not because they were weak investments, but because the systems through which investment decisions get made had consistently failed to see them clearly. The name was deliberate, and the explanation she gave for it has been repeated so many times since that it has taken on a kind of resonance beyond the specific story it came from. She said she chose the name because she understood what it meant to deliver something extraordinary in a moment when the world expected you to fall apart. She said she wanted every woman who had ever been handed the hardest thing in her most vulnerable moment to know that the moment does not define the ending. It is the beginning, and that what you build quietly, patiently, with full attention, in the early mornings and the late evenings and the closed-door hours when no one is watching, is yours. It is completely and documentably and legally yours. And the people who did not see you building it do not get to claim it simply because they were not paying attention. The fund invested in 47 companies in its first 3 years. Several of those companies are now valued at more than the initial investment. One employs over 800 people across 4 states. One is now the market leader in its category. One was founded by a woman who had been told, by 3 separate institutional investors in the same calendar year, that her idea was interesting but that she lacked the experience to execute it. She had the experience. The investors had not been looking at the evidence. They had been looking at their own assumptions about what a founder should look like, and she had not matched the image. Claire's fund looked at the evidence. They made the investment. The company grew. The investors who had passed were left to explain why they had passed, and the explanation, when they tried to construct it, did not hold up. Daniel's life took a different trajectory. The story had become known in the professional and social world he moved in, not as a headline that everyone could cite, but as a kind of reference point that circulated in the specific way that cautionary stories circulate, unnamed but recognizable, in communities where professional reputation is a currency. Several of his business partnerships ended in the years that followed the ruling. He eventually relocated, first to another city and then, by accounts that are less certain, out of the region entirely. He largely withdrew from public professional life. People who had known him before the story became public and who were honest about it said that he seemed, in the years after, like someone who was still processing a miscalculation so fundamental that he had not yet found the framework for understanding how it had happened. He had looked at a situation. He had assessed it. He had been certain. And he had been wrong in a way that could not be explained as bad luck or changed circumstances. He had been wrong because he had not seen clearly. And that is a particular kind of wrong that is very hard to make peace with. There is a question that stays with every person who hears this story, and it tends to surface in the quiet after the initial reaction, after the outrage at the hospital room moment, and the satisfaction of the legal ruling and the admiration for the delivery fund have settled into something more still. The question is, what was Daniel actually thinking? Not at the end, not in the law office, not in the hospital, but earlier. In the years of the marriage when Claire was building something in the margins of their shared life, and he did not know. Was he incurious? Was he simply not interested in her professional world? Was he so focused on his own story, its trajectory, its complications, its gap between expectation and reality, that the space beside him, where his wife was doing something extraordinary, just didn't register? Or did he see parts of it and not understand what he was looking at? And if so, why? We do not have clean answers to those questions, because Daniel has not offered them publicly, and it would not be fair to invent them. What we can say is that the pattern, a man who stops seeing his wife clearly, who fills in the space where her reality should be with assumptions that are more convenient for his own narrative, is not a rare pattern. It is, in fact, a very old one. It shows up in stories that predate this one and will show up in stories that come after it. The specific details change. The names change. The amounts change. But the structure is consistent. A woman who is building something real, quietly, without requiring anyone's permission or acknowledgement. A man who has decided what she is and stops checking whether his version matches the evidence. And a moment, sometimes a dramatic one, sometimes a quiet one, when the gap between the assumption and the reality becomes impossible to ignore. What makes Claire's story different from many versions of that pattern is not the money, though the money is what made the story spread. It is the completeness of her preparation. Most people who are underestimated do not have their response to that underestimation documented, dated, and legally established 14 months in advance. Most people are caught by the moment because the moment arrives without warning and without the infrastructure to absorb it. Claire was not caught because Claire had spent 18 months, and, arguably, her entire life before that, building the infrastructure. She had not built it because she knew this specific moment was coming. She had built it because she understood, at a level below conscious strategy, that the people who are underestimated need to be ready for the consequences of being underestimated. Not because it is fair that they should have to be, but because fair and prepared are different things, and she had always chosen to be prepared. This is what her daughter is growing up knowing. In a house with good light in the morning, in a city that has more room in it than the city before. She is growing up with a mother who built something extraordinary in the quiet time before she arrived, and who named a fund after the moment of her arrival, and who has made from everything that happened, the marriage and the dissolution of it, and the hospital room, and the lawyer's office, and the 43-page ruling, a kind of life that is larger and more useful than the one she was living before any of it happened. That is not a common outcome. Most people who go through what Claire went through come out smaller on the other side, at least for a while. The fact that she came out larger is a function of who she was before the story began. The girl at the back of the classroom, the woman at the kitchen table at 11:47, the person who saved a phone number she hoped she would never need. There is one more thing to say about this story, and it is the thing that matters most, and it is the thing that is hardest to say without it sounding like a lesson, which is not what it is. It is an observation, an honest one, about the way the world actually works for a significant number of people, and about what it requires of those people, and about whether that requirement is fair, and about what to do with the fact that it is both not fair and also real. A lot of people, a lot of women, specifically, because the pattern in this story is one that falls most heavily on women, though it is not exclusive to them, spend significant portions of their lives building things in the quiet, building them in the margins, building them in the hours that belong to no one and in the skills that get applied and then go unacknowledged and in the patience that gets mistaken for passivity and in the attention that gets mistaken for compliance. They build these things not because they are strategizing, not because they have anticipated the specific moment when the building will be tested, but because building is what they know, and because the alternative, not building, not developing, not quietly becoming more capable and more prepared, has always felt more dangerous than the work itself. And sometimes, those things get tested. Sometimes the moment comes, the way it came for Claire at 5:43 on a Tuesday afternoon, when the baby cried and the room was full of light and the envelope was on the tray. And in that moment, the question is not whether the building was done in time. The question is whether it was done at all. Whether the person holding that envelope has, somewhere, something that belongs entirely to her, something documented, something dated, something real, that the moment cannot take. Claire had that. She had spent 18 months making sure she had that. And those 18 months, not the $1 billion, not the ruling, not the fund, are what this story is actually about. The 18 months of early mornings and locked drawers and private attorneys and careful documentation. The work that no one saw. The preparation for a moment that she hoped would never arrive and that arrived anyway. Whatever your version of that work is, whatever it is that you are building in the quiet, in the margins, in the hours that belong to no one. This story is an argument for continuing. Not because you will end up with $1 billion. Most people do not. But because the work that you do in the quiet, when no one is watching, when no one is acknowledging it, when the person closest to you has stopped being curious about who you are, that work is yours. It is completely and documentable and legally yours. In every sense that matters. Keep building. And before you go, we need you to do 3 things. First, drop a comment below. Tell us what part of this story stayed with you the most. Was it the hospital room? Was it the 11:47 signature? Was it the 4 words Claire said when she read that envelope? We want to know. And tell us where in the world you are watching from. We read every single comment, and the community in this comment section is one of the best parts of what we do here. Second, if this story moved you, if it stirred something in you that you think someone else needs to feel, please share it. Send it to a friend. Post it somewhere it will be seen. Because there are women watching this right now who needed to hear this story today, and you might know exactly who they are. Third, and we say this every time because we mean it every time, hit that subscribe button right now if you have not already. Because the next story we are going to bring you, the story of a woman who was told she did not have the intelligence or the experience to run the company her late husband left her, and who ran it for 20 years, and who turned it into something that redefined an entire industry, and who, at the annual shareholders meeting in the 21st year, looked the men who had spent 2 decades doubting her directly in the eye and said exactly 4 words, "That story is coming, and you do not want to miss it." We will see you there.